They told you Rome was built on glory. They lied. Behind the marble statues and golden arches, there was a darker Rome, a Rome where power was maintained not through honor, but through terror. And at the center of this empire of shadows stood a man whose name was whispered like a curse. A ruler who turned torture into ritual, pain into spectacle, and cruelty into the very currency of his reign. His victims did not simply die, they were sculpted into suffering with red-hot irons, as though their agony itself was an offering to the gods of power. Imagine this, a chamber sealed beneath the imperial palace. The air thick with smoke, the smell of burning flesh, the glow of firelight dancing across polished instruments forged not for war, but for artificial torment. Hooks, spikes, brands, all heated until they glowed the color of the setting sun. And presiding over it all, not an executioner, not a soldier, but an emperor. A god in human form, seated high above, watching every scream, studying every flinch, savoring the breaking of the human spirit as though it were a fine performance. This was not random cruelty. This was psychology weaponized. He understood that torture was not only about the victim, it was about the audience. Senators, generals, even ordinary citizens invited to witness the red-hot dance of agony, each one reminded that Rome's ruler was not merely a man, but an architect of fear. Each shriek was a warning, each twisted body a lesson in obedience. And it worked. Whole factions bent their knees. Rivals vanished. Even whispers of rebellion died in throats before they could take shape. But here is the truth they never taught you in school: torture was never just punishment, it was programming. By normalizing horror, the emperor rewired the empire itself. Citizens became complicit. Soldiers became numb. The Senate became silent. Rome itself, once proud, became addicted to the theater of cruelty. And the man orchestrating it all, Domitian, the emperor of red-hot iron, was not just defending his power. He was feeding something older, something darker, something that still echoes in the hidden corridors of history. Because here's the secret: cruelty on that scale is never an accident. It is a system. And once you understand the system, you will never look at power the same way again. The marble steps led downward into silence. Guards stood like statues, their eyes hollow, their souls already surrendered to the emperor's will. And then, behind iron doors, the silence broke. The sound of chains scraping against stone, the moan of men whose screams had long since drained their voices, the hiss of fire heating tools designed not for death, but for endurance. This was Domitian's true throne room, not the Senate, not the palace, but the chambers where power revealed its sharpest edge. He was obsessed with fire. To Domitian, flame was not destruction, it was purification. Red-hot irons branded flesh, carving symbols of loyalty, or disloyalty, into human skin. Hooks heated until they glowed were pressed into bone, not to kill, but to remind the victim with every movement that Rome had claimed them body and soul. Spikes seared through muscle, while careful hands ensured no vital organs were pierced. Survival was mandatory. Death was too merciful. The emperor called it innovation. Others called it madness. But in truth, it was method. Pain, Domitian believed, was the ultimate mirror. In agony, masks fell away. Senators confessed betrayals they never committed. Generals betrayed their allies. Fathers renounced their sons. And Christians, those who refused to worship the emperor as a living god, became spectacles, their bodies offered to the flames as the crowd chanted Domitian's name. And yet, what made his cruelty different was not the tools, it was the intimacy. Domitian himself often attended the tortures. Seated above like a priest at a sacrifice, he demanded silence from his court while the screams of a single victim filled the chamber. His eyes would lock onto the prisoners, searching, studying, as if trying to extract something deeper than submission. To him, suffering was knowledge. Fear was truth. And through this twisted ritual, he ruled not only Rome's flesh, but its spirit. But here is the darkest part. Those chambers were not merely for punishment, they were theater. Pain was performed for the empire, rehearsed and perfected until cruelty itself became entertainment. Citizens began to cheer. Senators applauded. The lines between justice and sadism blurred, until the people no longer knew the difference. This is how tyranny survives, not by hiding its horrors, but by making them spectacle. And ask yourself this: if cruelty can be celebrated in public, what do you think is done in secret? The whispers began with craftsmen, blacksmiths ordered to forge something they dared not question. Iron bent into shapes no soldier would recognize, welded with precision, its purpose hidden until the emperor himself unveiled it. They called it the spiked throne. Imagine an iron chair lined with sharpened points, each carefully designed not to kill, but to pierce. Its true cruelty was in its perfection, because when fire was stoked beneath its base, the chair itself transformed into a living furnace. A victim would be stripped, bound, and lowered onto the seat. The spikes drove into flesh, shallow enough to avoid fatal wounds, deep enough to make every breath an agony. And when the fire licked at the iron, the spikes began to glow. Slowly, the heat transferred into the body, roasting from the inside out. Not fast, not merciful, but deliberately, excruciatingly slow. A man could linger for hours. Sometimes days. His own weight was his executioner, pressing him further down the longer he resisted. Domitian loved to describe this creation as art. To his court, he explained that it was justice, that loyalty must be proven not in words, but in suffering. But privately, his fascination ran deeper. He wanted to see how much the human spirit could endure before it shattered. Some victims cursed him until their last breath, others begged for mercy within minutes. Either way, he studied them, as if decoding the very architecture of fear. It wasn't just punishment. It was a message. For the senators, the generals, the citizens who dared to whisper rebellion, the image of a man writhing upon the spiked throne burned itself into memory. They carried it home, spoke of it in hushed tones, told their children to obey, because disobedience meant fire, iron, and humiliation. This was not justice. This was psychological warfare. And here's the truth hidden in plain sight: systems of power rarely invent tools to kill quickly. No, they design instruments that stretch pain across time, that turn terror into a seed planted inside the minds of all who witness it. That seed grows into silence, into obedience, into the surrender of freedom. And once an empire learns how to make cruelty into law, it becomes almost impossible to root it out. Domitian understood this. And perhaps that is why he rose higher, ruled longer, and sank deeper into darkness than any who came before him. Domitian did not merely rule Rome, he ruled its soul. Where his predecessors claimed divine favor, Domitian went further. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god. To disobey was not treason, it was blasphemy. And so the torture chambers became temples, the screams of victims became hymns, and the glowing irons became sacred relics of his reign. He blurred the line between punishment and worship, forcing Rome itself to kneel before him, not only in body, but in spirit. Christians were the easiest prey. They refused to bow, refused to burn incense before his image, refused to surrender their loyalty to any god but their own. To Domitian, this was perfect. Their defiance gave him martyrs to break, sacrifices to display. Bound in chains, they were branded with red-hot irons, their flesh marked as offerings. And when their cries filled the air, Domitian would raise his hand, silencing the chamber, commanding all to listen. This, he would say, is the sound of disobedience burned away. But his cruelty was not confined to outsiders. Senators who hesitated to praise him as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, found themselves dragged to the flames. Families watched as fathers were branded. Sons were forced to choose between denouncing their blood or joining them in agony. Religion was no longer faith, it was submission to the emperor's body, his word, his will. Rome's gods became masks for his power, and worship became another theater of fear. What few understood was that Domitian was not simply enforcing loyalty, he was engineering it. He knew the human mind clings to rituals, to symbols, to divine order. By merging torture with worship, he rewired belief itself. People began to associate obedience with survival, sacrifice with truth, pain with holiness. This was not faith, it was programming. And once programmed, men will kill, betray, or even sacrifice their own families to uphold the system that enslaves them. Here lies the deeper truth: empires always disguise control as devotion. They paint tyranny in the colors of religion, cloak cruelty in the language of the sacred, and make obedience feel holy. Domitian was not the first to do this, and he was not the last. But he perfected it. And in doing so, he transformed Rome into a machine, one powered not by justice or honor, but by fear dressed as faith. And yet, for all his power, cracks were forming. Because the same terror that silences men also breeds conspiracies in the dark. Terror can silence nations, but it cannot silence memory. Every senator who watched a colleague burn, every soldier who dragged screaming bodies into the chambers, every family who buried their loyalty alongside the ashes of their kin, each carried something inside them. Fear, yes. But also resentment. And resentment, when pressed too long beneath the weight of tyranny, begins to transform into something far more dangerous: conspiracy. By the mid-90s CE, Domitian's court was a palace of shadows. Smiles were masks, toasts were poison, and every banquet was a theater where the emperor tested loyalty. He played with fear like a musician with strings, plucking at nerves until men confessed sins they had never committed. But what he failed to understand was this: terror does not create loyalty. It creates actors. And behind every performance lies a hidden truth. The spiked throne, the bronze bull, the glowing irons, each horror had etched itself into the minds of Rome's elite. At first, they trembled. Then they endured. And then, they began to whisper. A chamberlain who had watched too many victims writhe in fire. A freedman whose family had been branded as traitors. A senator who carried the ghost of his son's screams. One by one, they recognized the same truth: Domitian's reign would end only when his blood spilled upon the very stones he had stained with others. And so the conspiracy was born. Not in the streets, not in the Senate, but within the emperor's own home. His chamberlain Parthenius. His steward Stephanus. Men who dined at his table, refilled his cup, knelt before him daily, these were the ones who began to sharpen daggers in silence. To survive, they had played their roles perfectly, feigning devotion, praising him as Lord and God. But beneath their smiles burned a secret oath: the torturer would taste his own fire. Domitian sensed it. Paranoia consumed him. He ordered walls lined with mirrors to watch his back, instructed servants to taste his food, demanded guards even in his private chambers. Yet no fortress is impenetrable when the enemy sleeps beside you. His greatest mistake was believing fear alone could keep men loyal. He forgot that a man pushed to the edge of terror ceases to fear death, and when death loses its sting, the tyrant loses his chains. And so, on the eve of his final day, the seeds of vengeance had already rooted deep. The only question was not if the emperor would fall, but when. Now, before we descend further, I need you to write something in the comments to lock yourself into this journey. Comment this phrase twice: iron burns, but truth endures. Write it now, because the deeper we go, the more you'll need that anchor. September 18, 96 CE. The palace was quiet, unnaturally so, as if even the stones themselves held their breath. Domitian had risen uneasy that morning, convinced that omens haunted him. He had ordered a servant executed the day before for bringing news he did not like. He had lashed out at his wife, accused his chamberlain of treachery, and even threatened to purge the Senate yet again. His paranoia had become prophecy, and yet, he still believed his iron hand could crush whatever shadows lurked around him. But in the corridors beyond his chamber, blades were being hidden beneath robes. 7 conspirators, each carrying the memory of a different atrocity, gathered in silence. Among them was Stephanus, feigning injury, his arm bound in a sling to conceal the dagger within. His steps faltered deliberately, each movement calculated to disarm suspicion. Fear coursed through them, but so did something stronger, rage forged in fire, sharpened by years of humiliation. When Domitian entered the room, the trap snapped shut. Stephanus approached, presenting a petition, his eyes downcast. The emperor reached for it, and in that instant, the first blade flashed. Steel tore into flesh. Domitian staggered, his eyes widening not in disbelief, but in fury. He lunged, claws outstretched, gouging at Stephanus's face, desperate to blind his assassin. Blood spattered the marble floor. The air filled with the sound of struggle, grunts, curses, gasps, as more blades plunged into the emperor's body. He fought like a beast cornered, dragging his attackers with him, fingers tearing at eyes and throats. But no tyrant, however feared, can withstand the weight of 7 blades driven by vengeance. One after another, the steel bit deeper, each thrust a reckoning for a different crime. His power meant nothing now. His voice, once commanding nations, reduced to guttural cries drowned in blood. The marble floor beneath him became his canvas, painted with the masterpiece of his own downfall. The emperor who had crafted tortures designed to stretch out agony now felt time collapse around him. Every scream he had ever summoned in his chambers seemed to echo back, mirrored in his own. He clawed until his strength failed, gasped until air deserted him, and finally, collapsed like any other mortal. No audience cheered. No ritual sanctified this death. Only the conspirators stood, trembling, drenched in sweat and blood, their faces pale not with fear but with the weight of what they had done. The god had been unmasked. The torturer lay broken. Rome itself exhaled. But here lies the darkest truth, even as his blood dried on the stones, the system he built, the theater of fear, the machinery of obedience, did not die with him. It simply waited for its next master. The conspirators stood over Domitian's corpse, blades slick with blood, hands trembling with the weight of vengeance. For a moment, Rome breathed again. The tyrant was gone. But freedom did not follow. Because empires do not fall with men. They survive them. Systems of fear, once perfected, never vanish, they adapt. And Domitian's Rome had already been rewired, its people conditioned to mistake cruelty for justice, obedience for faith, and survival for loyalty. His death was a moment, but the machinery of control he forged kept grinding forward. Look closely at history and you will see the same pattern repeated. Leaders who turn pain into spectacle. Rulers who sanctify their cruelty by calling it holy. Governments that build instruments not to kill quickly, but to prolong suffering, to stretch terror into every corner of the human mind. Domitian was not an anomaly. He was a blueprint. His iron chair, his bronze bull, his red-hot brands, these were not relics of a madman. They were prototypes for every regime that learned how to weaponize fear. And here is the truth most men never dare to face: we live inside the same pattern now. The tools look different, media instead of fire, laws instead of spikes, surveillance instead of chains, but the psychology is the same. Fear programmed into the masses. Rituals of obedience disguised as tradition. The illusion of choice while power writes the script. Domitian would recognize it instantly, and he would smile, because the empire never truly ended. It merely changed costumes. This is why men like you must awaken. Because once you see the system, you can no longer unsee it. Once you understand that cruelty is not chaos but design, you begin to reclaim the power stolen from you. They want you numb. They want you obedient. They want you to cheer your own suffering, just as Rome once cheered the glow of red-hot iron against human flesh. But you have a choice: remain asleep in the theater of fear, or step out of it, reborn, unshackled, dangerous in your awareness. The knowledge is dangerous, yes. But it is also the key. So let me leave you with this: Domitian is dead. But the empire of fear is not. And the question you must answer is simple: will you continue to be the audience, or will you finally become the man who walks out of the theater, never to return?